words? No, because wherever any circumstance is constant, we tend in the course of time to ignore it. We rule it out of all practical politics because it is basic to everything. So as in an equation, when you get two terms that are identical on either side of the equation, you can just cancel them out. They make no difference. But in a way, this is a very difficult point because obviously it is highly important that the diaphragm be there, because otherwise there wouldn't be any voices or any music. And yet the diaphragm as such makes no difference to the distinctions between voices and musical instruments and so on. From a logical point of view, it is absolutely meaningless to talk about anything which is common to everything, which is the substratum or ground of being. But the categories of logic do not embrace all knowledge. And it is possible for human beings once again to become aware in a certain way of this substratum. Not, however, as an object, not as something you can take out and look at, but nevertheless to be very strongly and almost sensuously aware of it. And in so doing regain a new sense of one's own identity, one's own being, not as one of many things, one little event among many events that are all coming and going and temporary, but a sense of one's actual self as being this single energy field, which can't be, however, defined or identified. And through realizing that, to take away the frantic anxiety that we have to secure ourselves as separate organisms and to fight with other organisms and play these elaborate games of one-upmanship, and above all, to overcome the anxiety which leads us to regard nature itself as our enemy that has to be conquered and subjugated. I shall, of course, return in later sessions to the nature of this realization. But I only want to say in passing that there's a very peculiar thing about it. Namely, that the realization I'm speaking of is not something like a belief. It is not an idea, for the simple reason that the fundamental energy of the universe cannot be embraced in an idea. It cannot be embraced in a concept, in a form of words, in an explanation, because it eludes all classification, because it is the which than which there is no whicher, and therefore is not in any class. Secondly, if you try to catch hold of it and somehow possess it, you are doing what is called in Zen putting legs on a snake, because there is no need to possess it. You are it, and if you try to possess it, you imply that you're not. So by trying to catch hold of it, you, as it were, push it away, although you can't really push it away, because the very pushing is all it, you see. So there are people who are divided into two schools of thought: those who believe that by exerting their energies to get hold of it, they can achieve something, and the opposite people who think that by doing nothing at all, one achieves it. But both are wrong, because both the attempt to get it and the attempt to try not to get it are actually attempts to get it. And there is no need to. But nevertheless, going into this by meditation and so on, it is possible to realize that we are identical with the fundamental energy of the universe, that that is our real self, and although it doesn't make a difference, because all differences are in a way made by it, therefore it makes no difference to differences. Nevertheless, it's completely basic. You see, it's as if what has happened to us is, supposing you're a gambler, and you've got involved in a game where you're playing actually for peanuts, and you are immensely wealthy. When you get extremely absorbed in the game, even though you're only playing for peanuts, you can lose your temper, and you can be anxious as to who's going to win, who's going to lose. Am I going to lose my peanuts, you see? Whereas you really have nothing to worry about at all. But you've got so absorbed in the details of this game that you've forgotten the larger context in which the game is happening. So in exactly the same way, every individual is so absorbed myopically with his mind in the details of his birth and death that he has completely forgotten the context in which birth and death is occurring. And so, just as the chicken, when you put his beak to a chalk line, can't get off it and is hypnotized, so we have been systematically and progressively hypnotized by our whole upbringing into the sensation that we are only this particular ego in this body. And we believe that and feel it so firmly that the context in which all this has happened is completely repressed. Now, therefore, I want to propose a few things, first of all, in thinking about this. And I would ask you to listen to what I have to say, temporarily postponing the question, what are the practical consequences? What should we do about it? I want to start with a consideration of our ancient ideas about the relation of the individual to the world in terms of fate and free will, or determinism and free will. Because if we actually were aware of all the information that is coming to us through our senses, we would have a very curious sensation which would bug us because we wouldn't be able to find words for it. It would be like this. You would first of all realize that if you didn't be so selective, in other words, if you didn't pay attention to this detail and that detail, but were just simply aware of it all in general, you would get the funny feeling, in the first place, that you were just a puppet, that you were automatically responding to all kinds of physical and social influences around you, and that you couldn't help yourself. You might object to that, or you might alternatively enjoy it. You might get a sensation that you were just floating. You didn't have to do anything. You didn't have to think about any problems. You didn't have to worry about what you ought to do. You would just feel yourself responding. And that would be a very pleasant feeling if you liked it. But on the other hand, depending on your personal constitution, you might feel terribly threatened by it. And you would interpret this sensation as a feeling of unreality. Have you ever suddenly felt that you were dreaming everyday life? That it wasn't quite real? And it spooked you? So you said, gee, it ought to be happening, see? I feel I'm going around in a dream. Because occasionally our mind slips. It's like the tuning dial of a radio. It occasionally wanders off and you get another station. And so in the same way, our minds occasionally slip into another way of seeing things. And people get accidental illuminations and psychoses and all sorts of funny things. But you would get this as a preliminary sensation, and you would interpret it as feeling that you are a puppet on the end of strings being manipulated by events, only because of your previous background, wherein we have all of us been conditioned to believe that part of our life is not under our control, and part of it is. There is this distinction between the voluntary and the involuntary. The voluntary, what we do; the involuntary, what we have to accept passively. The borderline between them is not at all clear. Breathing, for example. is something we have to go on doing, and yet you can acquire the sensation that you are doing the breathing and controlling it according to your will. It's a very vague distinction here. But if you took in all the information, see, you can feel yourself making a decision out of the blue. You say, I'm going to do that, like that, you see, and you don't have any awareness of anything that leads up to it. It just happens, you see. And because that awareness is screened out, you interpret this act of making a decision as a different kind of act from breathing or from growing hair. Well, actually, it isn't different. But we think it's different because of unawareness. When you make a decision, it happens, as the Chinese say, ziran, shizen, of itself, naturally, spontaneously. But we feel that there are things that happen of themselves in contrast to certain things that I do. And that is because of incomplete awareness. But then, if that awareness were to change, and you were to realize that everything is happening of itself, including your decisions, because of your background, you would then veer over to the opposite point of view. Everything is happening involuntarily, and I am left out. I'm a puppet. I simply have to obey. You see? But this would be incorrect. The point is rather this. We don't have a system of nature which is either deterministic or voluntaristic. The relationship of the individual to the environment is not one of the individual as some little thing in the environment which is moved by the environment and responds to the environment passively. Nor, oppositely, do we have a situation in which the individual is a center of activity that all of its own to some extent alters and changes the environment. Both of these opinions are based on lack of awareness or ignorance. What we have is rather something like this, that the behavior of the individual and the behavior of the environment are the same process. And you can look at the process from 2 points of view. You can look at it from the point of view of it's all happening to me, or you can look at it from the point of view, I'm doing it. These are just 2 poles of 2 ways of looking at the same thing. If, for example, you realize that your neurological organization is creating the external world. In other words, there is no such thing as light, weight, heat, color, shape, except in terms of the human nervous system or some other animal nervous system. Then from that point of view, you can see your nervous system as evoking the whole universe. But you can take an opposite point of view, which is equally true, which is that the human nervous system is something in the external world and is entirely dependent on sun and air and light and temperature and so on and so forth. Both points of view are true, but we have not yet, especially in the West, become aware of a logic which can integrate them. And so when we first come to experience this thing as being so, we attempt to interpret it in terms of our old logics and our old ways of thinking. So that one person may say, on feeling this, I feel as if I'm just floating around, passively responding to the operations of nature. And another person going to the opposite extreme will interpret this experience as saying, I suddenly realize I'm God, that I actually govern and control everything that happens. These are 2 ways of looking at exactly the same thing. The point being, then, that there is just one process which is equally the behavior of the organism and the behavior of the environment. That you can look at this process from many points of view, define it in many ways, but you can't really split it up. And so the consequence of this, although I'm not going into this at the moment in any full way, is to learn to act and behave in terms of this vision of the world. Not as you're acting upon the world, not as it acting upon you, but as the unfoldment of a process which, as you understand it, you become more intelligent and act more intelligently. Intelligence is a function of the degree to which you realize that your behavior is one with the behavior of the rest of the world. The more you realize that, the more, one would say, you appear to be better in control, although you're not actually controlling. The difficulty, the essential difficulty that lies in the way of most people seeing this is the fixed notion that the world consists of separate things and separate events. As Teilhard de Chardin put it, the only real atom is the universe. The word atom, you see, in Greek, is atomos. Non, tomos, cut. The uncut. It's the same idea as in Lao Tzu, the uncarved block, as a great symbol of naturalness. What cannot be further divided? And so de Chardin says it is the universe that is the only real atom. Because if you take anything out of the universe and separate it, you will find it is raveled at all its edges. It is not, in other words, cleanly divisible. But this is something which is left out of our ordinary awareness. Because in our ordinary awareness, we overlook the connections that go between so-called things and so-called events, and make them actually nothing but aspects of one event. It's as if we were looking at everything through a sort of Venetian blind, where intervals are ignored and cut out. Our senses are, of course, as we know, screening devices. The eye responds to a very narrow spectrum of the various forms of light vibrations. We do not see X-rays or cosmic rays. Likewise, our ear responds only to a rather narrow spectrum of sound. We keep screening out. And therefore, not only do we screen with our senses, with the organs of sense, we also screen with the thinking systems by which we interpret what we sense. It's a further act of screening. And so as a result of this, there are gaps. And these gaps are symbolized by the fact that we ignore space. We think, as we all sit around here in this room, you see, that the spaces between each of us as we sit here is nothing at all. It's not important. But actually, it's tremendously important. The spaces between people, and space as a marvelous thing in itself, is as important as, for example, the intervals between tones in music. It is the intervals and the hearing of the intervals that enables you to hear melody. And so it is the space between everything which, instead of being something that divides, it joins. But we ignore it and don't see that space, like the diaphragm in the radio, space is that in which everything happens, and without space, no happening. It's fundamental. but ignored. And there are many other things besides. All kinds of mutual influencing constantly going on. But this is ignored because, for one reason, or two reasons. One, we don't have time to bother with it. We don't think it's important. And we don't think it's important because we have been trained to regard only certain things as important. And that's why in the process, say, of meditation, as it's understood by Buddhists and Taoists, you stop valuing and putting a price on all the various things that you could be aware of. You stop thinking, and you are simply aware. And it suddenly strikes you then that everything is equally important. And you start being amazed at things that you never were amazed at before. Absolutely fascinating. You hear the sound of water. And that's quite as important as anything I've got to say. Only you don't translate it, see? The wisest thing I heard in Japan when I was last there, from Morimoto Roshi, he said, the sound of the rain needs no translation. We were talking about translating Buddhist texts into English. He said, you don't need to do that. The sound of the rain needs no translation. So when you get that perspective and you realize that the divisions of one thing from another are all conceptual, cut out the concepts and see it afresh, and there are no divisions. There are connections. It doesn't mean that in the continuum of the physical world that there are no lines, that there are no solids and spaces and all this kind of thing. It doesn't mean, in other words, that if you saw the world correctly, it would all become a homogenized mass. A lot of people think that that is the nirvana. You know? That doesn't mean that at all. It stays just exactly as you see it now. But it has a completely different sense to it, in which all the wiggles in this world are not separated, but it's a continuous wiggle. I'm greatly interested in the philosophy of wiggles, because this is a wiggly world. Look at the hills. As you fly, as I've just been flying, getting some perspective of nature from an airplane, and it's clouds and mountains, all wiggles. But just every now and then one sees these little squares and rectangular patterns and things, and you know that's human beings, busy trying to straighten things out. They somehow disapprove of wiggles, because wiggles are difficult to control. They're slippery. And you want to put that thing there and say, now, come on. But you see, the trouble with a wiggle is, how do you count wiggles? How do you count the wiggles in a cloud? I mean, formally speaking, is one wiggle a smooth curve like that? Does that constitute a wiggle? Or supposing it has bumps on it, are those each a subordinate wiggle? And how many wiggles does the bump have? It has lots when you start looking at it in a magnifying glass. It goes on forever. So wiggles of the world unite. You've nothing to lose but your names. So you see, this is great continuous wiggliness, for purposes of being controlled and managed, is broken down into what we call things and events. But these are no other than conventional, that is to say, socially agreed divisions between the various forms of nature. But nature is really formless, in the sense that it's all one form. Not in the sense that there are nothing that we could stick the name cloud on. but that naming the cloud a cloud does not separate the cloud from the sky, actually. Just as when you pick up water in a sieve, you don't succeed in separating the water into strips like you would if it was cheese going through a sieve. So all our categorizing leaves the world undivided. In fact, it is simply a way of being able to talk about it in order to agree how we are going to control it and what we're going to do with it. Now, this is a point that is so fundamental that I do want to be sure that it's clear. To say, you see, that there really are no things and no events is to most people shocking and startling. It's an affront to common sense. Because we feel, you know, damn it, this is a shoe. And it's a thing, it's there, you see. And, but actually, this isn't a shoe at all. You know, the shoe is a noise. And if this is a noise at all, it's this sort of noise. You can use it for a hat. Oh, it has all sorts of possibilities. But it isn't a shoe. Yeah, yeah, right. So, if you see that the idea of separate things is an abstraction, let's call it that, then this most of all applies to you. As an organism, you are not a separate thing. You are, first of all, you can look at it from 2 points of view. On the one hand, a living organism is something like a flame. A flame, although it appears on a candle to be constant, is a stream of gas. And a flame is never the same for 2 microseconds. It's a constant flowing of energy. Or take a whirlpool in a stream. It appears to have a constant form, but it's flowing all the time. So in exactly the same way, all our bodies appear to have constant form, but we are a flowing of energy. So we keep coming in and out. Also, it isn't only in this way that we're the constant flow, that you cannot say I'm a separate event. But it's also because everything that could be recognized as a wiggle or a unit of any kind in this world has its existence only in relation to all the rest of them. This is the principle that in Buddhist philosophy is called Jiji Muge, the mutual interpenetration of all things and events. This is very important. I'm sure some of you have recently read in, say, the Scientific American about holograms, a method whereby you can take a small square out of a photographic negative and by the use of laser beams reconstruct the whole negative out of which it was taken. Because the little part is nurtured and comes to be in a field of forces in such a way that all the lines of force within the little part imply the lines of force of the total photograph when it was taken. It can be reconstructed. Maybe Wynne can explain this more accurately than I can. But this essentially is the hologram. Because you see, every part, anything that can be designated as a part of something, implies the whole, just as the whole implies the part. Thus, a clever anthropologist can take a jawbone and can reconstruct from the jawbone, through all his anthropological knowledge, the beast or man to which it originally belonged. You say a jawbone like this, you see, implies this kind of a skull and so on and so forth. So every single thing in this world exists only in relation to the whole system, to all the other things. Because the important point to realize here is that existence is relationship. Relationship is another word for existence. There is no yang without the yin. It is the relationship of yang and yin that enables yang to be possible and yin to be possible, solid to be possible and space to be possible, up and down, life and death, being and non-being. It is a relationship. So that, for example, if I have a drum, but there is no skin on the drum, it doesn't matter how hard I hit it, it will make no sound. Because the sound is the relationship of the drum skin and the hand. And you can carry that principle all the way along. In other words, if I shout in a completely non-resonating environment, I will make no noise. In other words, if I shout in a vacuum, there is no sound. Because I have to make waves, you see, and I can't make waves if there's no water. So the existence is relationship all the way along. And fundamentally then, the relationship of all of us together, of all society, constitutes every one of us. We are, as individuals, as personalities, what we are in terms of a human community and of an interlocking complex of communities. And you may remember when you were children, I remember it very vividly, how my personality changed in relation to each community that I went into. In other words, I was one boy at home. I was a completely different boy among my peer group in school. I was another boy altogether when visiting my uncle. And I've realized I had all these different personalities in relation to different communities. And eventually, I put them together in some sort of way and integrated. But I feel still, although I've got them more or less together, I like to come on differently in different sets of people and play the joker, which instead of playing a fixed role, and you can say, well, is that always you? Can we rely upon you always to have this sort of behavior, mannerisms, and reactions? You say, no, I'm not going to get fixed up in that. I'm going to play tricks. But you did notice that, you see, when you were a child, because you see, you were being defined all the time by the groups you were in. And so you are what you are as a person, that is to say, as playing a role in life in relation to the groups around with which you move. And that is a little model of the fact that everything is what it is in its place. Now, for example, it has been a sort of convention of scientific thought hitherto, especially in the kind of science of the 19th century, to try to understand anything and say what it is by a process of analysis. You understand it by asking, what is it made of? How is it composed? How was it put together? And so you dissect it. You get your microscopes out and you try to dissolve it down to the smallest possible component parts. And that gives a certain explanation of it, you see. But what is equally important is to look in the other direction. A thing, what anything is defined not only in terms of what it's made of, but of when it is and where it is. Its context in time and space. Just as the meaning of a word is dependent on the context of the sentence or the paragraph or the book in which it is found. So, likewise, we with our rather myopic way of looking at things, because analysis, the ability to analyze and to think analytically, comes from great skill in dividing wiggles. See, you may think that this is a very, very fine wiggle, you see, but I can make wiggles so little that you can't keep track of them because you're not as sharp as I am, see. I'm going to make wiggles that we're going to have a little competition. Who can make the smallest wiggle and keep track of them? Because that's the test. If you can keep track of them, and you can prove it to someone else, because if you get down so small nobody can keep track of you, then they don't know whether you're a charlatan or not. But if you can keep track of the wiggles and prove to other people that you kept track of them. See, this is the whole game of scholarly one-upmanship. If you can keep track of it. Same with certain kinds of music, you see. You can do very complicated rhythms, and they'll believe you if you can do it again. And it's not enough to do it once. They say, do that again. Oh, was that a fluke? That shows, you see, you're in control, and you've been able to count out the beats. So, through the analytical mind that pays attention to the details, we have got great skill in doing that. But you do that at the expense of neglecting completely the other side of things, is in what context does every individual wiggle happen? See, that's just the other side of it. It's very important to define the wiggle, but you can't define the wiggle unless the wiggle has an environment. The outside of the wiggle is as important as the inside. So in the same way, everybody has an outside and everybody has an inside. We identify ourselves with what is inside. Say, that's me. And thereby ignore the fact that what is outside you is just as much your outside as what is inside you is your inside. And that's always overlooked. And I mean, when I talk about your outside, I don't mean just the surface of your skin. I mean everything outside your skin. That's your outside. And if that isn't functioning in a certain way, the inside doesn't function either. They go together. It's like when a snake moves. The snake makes a curl, and so one side of it is convex and the other side is concave. Which side moves first? Why, they both move together. And so in the same way, the inside world and the outside world are not different. In the sense that they're not separate. They're different, yes. One's inside, the other's outside, but they're not separate. They move together. Only we're unaware of it, in the ordinary way, through a kind of psychological myopia, of fixing on, of being hung up on certain ways of looking at things. There's a Buddhist word, klesha, in Sanskrit, bonno in Japanese, that we normally translate attachment or defiling passion. The exact translation of klesha in modern American is hang up. It's a perfect word for it, to have a hang up. And so to be hung up on a fixed way of looking at things, that the world is only divided in this way and that way and the other way, is to fail to see what I've been describing then as the going togetherness, the inseparability of all insides from all outsides and vice versa, and of all organisms from their environments and vice versa. You can get this very clearly when you realize that if you get hung up on the viewpoint of separateness, then even your body is not a unity. You are just a mass of cells. And if then you take in physics, you're not even cells, you're molecules. Not even molecules, just atoms. Not even atoms, just subatomic particles, wavicles, or wavicles. And you disintegrate everything into that, and you realize that there are vast spaces between all these tiny little wiglets, whatever they are, wavicles. Huge spaces. I mean, if a molecule in your body was magnified to the size of a tennis ball, the nearest one would be quite a way away. Well, what ties all this together? You know, how can you look at that as a unity? Well, it's tied together by space. Fields of force, gravitation. And so in exactly the same way, look at us behaving around here from a larger level of magnification. You can very easily see that we are just as tied together as the molecules in our hands. And that generation after generation, you know, we come and go. You look at the leaves coming on the trees in the spring. And you can say, you can describe this in so many different ways. You can say these are new leaves. Last year's leaves fell off and have fallen into the ground. And now a new generation of leaves come, which are quite different. And if the leaf had an ego, you see, you say, wow-wee, I've come into being. I'm new. But from another point of view, you could just say, the tree is leafing again. This is something the tree does, like every so often. A man gets up in the morning and he shaves. He's shaving, see? And he stops doing that. Next morning, he's shaving again. Now, is the shaving, is it something that has an ego? When every day's shave is a different shave? It is from one point of view. It is different, but it's also shaving. It's the same. It's because we are so fascinated with the individual details of people that generation after generation we say they're quite different. But somebody who really was from Mars and didn't understand people would say they keep on coming. They're just the same ones coming back. So every year's leaves are the same old leaves coming back, see? They die, and they are reabsorbed, and they keep coming back. The thing keeps doing it again. But there are these spaces in it, you see? It's like the troughs between the crests of a wave. And we say, where there are those spaces, we don't see anything, so we say, well, that's finished. So when you die, you think, well, that's finished. Too bad. But you see, what you are really is the energy field, and it keeps doing you. It keeps peopling. And it's you who keep peopling. Who else is responsible? Only, of course, we mustn't admit that. We're responsible for this. So the whole game is to pretend you aren't. See that it's happening and it's not most, it's nothing to do with me. I'm not in control of this.
Our program continues with Session 6, A New Relationship to the Material Present with Alan Watts.
In this morning's session, I was emphasizing primarily the theoretical aspects of ecological awareness, showing how our differentiation between separate things and events is an abstraction, and that the whole world is an inseparable unity, not of separate parts, but of the kind of system in which everything that might be called a part when we talk about it, everything that might be called a part is in fact an expression or function of the whole thing. And that if we came to our senses, we would be aware of ourselves, not as only on the inside of our skins, but we would be aware that the outside is us too. That there is a relationship between the organism and the environment, the subject and the object, and the individual and the world, such that the two presuppose each other. And I did get around to the point of mentioning towards the end the reason how and why this can become apparent if our minds are not constantly obsessed with verbiage. If, in other words, we can come to contemplating, seeing, feeling the actual world without putting names and labels on it. In other words, to see it directly rather than thinking about it. For, as I said, these separations are conceptual. Now, I want to take this into a more practical dimension this afternoon. That is to say that hand in hand with this whole question of overcoming the hallucination of separateness, there goes also the formation of a new style of relationship to the material present. It's very important, you see, first of all, to realize that all reality is present. That the present moment is where you have always lived and where you will always live. There is no other time than now. Time past and time future are also abstractions. But in our culture in particular, we have a very bad relationship to the material present. Not only to the present, but also to that aspect of the same thing which is material. And this comes out so strongly in the way in which we educate our children. We do not, in our schools, really have anything very much which relates people to the material present. And thus our achievements in regard to the handling of the material present are extremely shoddy. School prepares people for a kind of Brahmin's existence. That is to say, for literary, verbal operations. It educates us to be bureaucrats, insurance salesmen, bankers' clerks, accountants, lawyers, maybe doctors, and so on. And a person who is going on, say, in high school, and is thought not fit for college, is encouraged to take reluctantly offered courses in trades and manual skills. And in England, where the state of affairs is much worse than it is here even, they always make jokes about American universities where you can get a BA degree in basket weaving. Because that's infra dig. That is loss of face in an academic community that there should be basket weaving courses. But the point of the matter is that we are so obsessed with the life of abstractions, with problems of status, with problems of the world as symbolized rather than the world to be symbolized, that most of us don't relate to physical existence at all. Now, I remember, and I mentioned this in one of those leaflets I sent out, but I remember very well in 1936 in London at the World Congress of Faiths, when Suzuki Daisetsu was present. He's the one who's written all the essays on Zen Buddhism, the great scholar. And he had made a very, very significant contribution to the Congress, various lectures and discussions he had held. And at the final meeting of the Congress, they took over the Queen's Hall, great big auditorium, and they set as the subject matter for the evening the supreme spiritual ideal, upon which representatives of all the great religious traditions got up and delivered themselves of volumes of hot air. Finally, Suzuki was the last speaker. And he got up and he said approximately, "I am feeling very confused tonight. I am a simple countryman from a faraway place, and I find myself in this assembly of so learned people. I am asked to talk about supreme spirit or ideal. Seems to me I do not know what supreme spirit or ideal is, so I look up spiritual in dictionary, and I cannot understand. He said, you have around here a very big city, and I walk along the street and very prosperous, but it's not right. You have spiritual over here, you have material world over here, and both are unreal. And then he went on to give a description of his house and garden in Japan. And at the end of it, he had a standing ovation. For somehow he was real. He came across as somebody who was lovable, intelligible, and human, as distinct from a mere preacher. And he made this intensely important point, that if you understand the spiritual correctly, it is not different from the material. The material is the spiritual. But in order to see why that is so, one first has to make a clear difference between the material and the abstract, and to understand that the abstract doesn't mean the same thing as the spiritual. The abstract world is a world of symbols, a world of words, a world of concepts, which has the same relation to the physical universe as the menu to the dinner, or as money to wealth. I mean money in the sense of bookkeeping entries in a bank or dollar bills. One must be very careful, therefore, not to confuse the spiritual and the abstract. If by the spiritual we designate the domain of ultimate reality, the unified, or more strictly non-dual energy of the universe that I was talking about this morning, that has nothing whatsoever really to do with abstractions. What we call physical reality, the material world, is much closer to what would be meant by spiritual than anything abstract is. But the thing is that when we form in our minds, the average person who talks about the physical world, he has a concept of the physical world, which is what really should be referred to as materiality when one uses that word in a put-down way. If, for example, I could even say this to theologians and they would eventually understand me. If we talk about the evils of the flesh, the word the flesh doesn't mean the body in the sense of this. The flesh, as something evil, represents a conception of the body as something to be exploited in order to satisfy one's spiritual emptiness. And thus, too, when we speak of materialism, we aren't really talking about materialism. We're talking about an abstract conception of the value of the material world. Real materialism would, of course, be the love of material, which is something quite different from materialism as one sees it in practice. So it's very important to realize that when we say the physical world and we talk about matter as something which is antithetical to the spiritual, you are not talking about this. Because all this doesn't have those kind of qualities that we would call materiality. as against the spiritual. If you really get in touch with your senses, with the so-called physical world, you're in for many surprises. First of all, if you go back to the point I made, that there really is only the present, you will see that what we call this physical world is not something expanded in time, stretched out over time. And it is not material also in the sense of being composed of stuff. You see, one of our problems in the West is we think about the relationship of the spiritual to the physical by analogy with form and matter, or rather with clay as matter and the form as the pot made out of the clay. And therefore we've never been able to put the two together because our conception of matter as something essentially like clay, a sort of primordial stuff, this has no intelligence, nor does it possess energy. Therefore, when you think of the world as a sort of cooperation or a mixture of form and matter, you have therefore to invoke an external agency to inform matter and to bring it into shape, to order it, and to produce art. But this dualism of form and matter is really rather meaningless. Nobody ever saw an immaterial form or a formless material. There really is no such thing as stuff out of which the universe is made. Stuff is actually a word for looking at the world with bad focus. When your focus on something is not clear, it is fuzzy. And this fuzziness or indistinctness is stuff. When your focus on the world is clear, you see pattern, you see details, you see structure. Now, as you look more deeply into any structure, it starts to get fuzzy again. And therefore you ask, of what stuff is this structure made? Stuff meaning fuzz. But then again, when you turn up the level of magnification, and it once becomes bright and clear, you see within the great structures and the great patterns, smaller ones. So you always encounter the world as patterning, never as stuff. And so our physical world that surrounds us is in a way immaterial. It is a fantastic pulsation of vibrations which give an illusion of solidity in just the same way that if I take a lighted cigarette in the dark and rapidly revolve it, you get the illusion of a continuous circle of fire. So the apparent motion of the present moment from the past to the future gives an illusion of continuity, as if there was something extended in time. And in exactly the same way, the table, because it is vibrating with such tremendous energy, gives an illusion of solidity in exactly the same way as the blades of a propeller or an electric fan when they're in rotation. And in the same way as you will come to trouble if you try to put your finger through the fan. The only reason you can't get your finger through the table, it's going even faster than a fan, and it bounces your finger off. When you feel hardness, your finger is being bounced off because of this tremendous energy that lies in and as the table. Likewise, it's also in your finger. What we're actually confronted with, what is here and now ever, is certainly not a material world as we ordinarily conceive it, but is something intensely magical and strange. Spinoza once said, "The more you know of particular things, the more you know of God." And then put it in another way. If you want to find out what is the spiritual, what is Buddha nature, what is Brahman, what is Tao, the best way is to go directly to the physical world and find out. The physical world as you are it and as everything around you is it, the immediate experience. Now to go back, this, as I said, is something which our culture, which WASP culture in particular, neglects, because we are obsessed with abstract attainments. And this goes back to some curious factors in our history. To introduce this matter, I have to refresh your minds about caste, strangely enough. In ancient Hindu society, there are 4 castes, respectively Brahmins, who are priests, theologians, philosophers, and intellectuals. Kshatriya, who are warriors and rulers, politicians. Vaishya, who are merchants, and Shudra, who are laborers, blue-collar workers. These castes have something peculiar about them in the fact that they are eternal. Let me say perennial. They still exist, even though we don't admit it. There are Kshatriya people around, and they are very different from Brahmins. The typical fraternity American, with his crew cut, uses alcohol, is aggressive, likes football, and so on, he's a Kshatriya type. The professorial, quiet fellow is a Brahmin. The businessman is a Vaishya, and our blue-collar people are Shudras. They're still there. And they are all necessary to each other. They balance each other in a very fascinating way. The Brahmin cannot get on